All right. Good morning, everybody. We were so close to wrapping up chapter 18. Just a couple slides left to go, but they're important ones. So, uh, we talked about all sorts of details with humoral immunity, and we've mentioned vaccination uh, for the potential to stimulate immune cells and to confer some protective immunity. Let me back it up to this. So, this last little frame here, immunity through a vaccine, active, artificially acquired, right? So, all sorts of different types of vaccines uh, that help to stimulate. Uh, Depends on what we're talking about, different types of bacteria or virus. And we think about pieces typically of those that stimulate the immune response. Sometimes we think about a virus that has been inactivated. Sometimes they call them killed virus, but then you have to go back and ask yourself the question, is a virus alive in the first place? Can you kill it? It's inactivated. So same sort of idea. All right. All sorts of different potentials for this. All right. And as we move into some of the infectious disease, we'll talk about some possibilities with vaccination with those topics. So one of the first accounts of trying to confer some immunity goes way back to this practice called variolation. It was first observed, and we see this woodcut here with the practice occurring right here. This started in the Far East, and the practices were observed. If my memory is correct, I believe it was Lady Montagu that had traveled and witnessed this practice and brought it back to Europe uh, because smallpox was super bad news. All right. And in turn, the idea with this, I find a little bit disturbing, but also a little impressed as well. So, what's happening in this image, this variolation, what they would do uh, is to get an individual with smallpox to pick the scabs off of these individuals, grind it up, and blow those dust particles, scab particles, up the nostrils of an uninfected individual with the hopes that you confer some immunity. Maybe you do. Maybe you just gave them some smallpox because that also happened. There were numerous things. You ultimately truly can contract smallpox by coming in contact with these lesions. Getting scabs blown up your nostrils is potentially just begging for that potential. So I have heard all sorts of details about this, like you don't just pick it off and blow it right up there. They need to be picked off and allowed to stand, maybe slap it in your pocket for a little bit, a few days before you're ready to go. And that potentially minimizes the potential of the individual contracting smallpox. I don't know for sure. All right. But there were definitely hints the individuals that received this type of treatment had some protection against smallpox. What also observed the opposite in some people contracting it. All right. But the stage is set for thinking about this. And so smallpox still what we're thinking about. All right. Jenner Edward Jenner recognized some similar details. All right. This is not smallpox. Smallpox is considerably worse than this. I'm sure images could be found. This mild, if you will. All right. Doesn't look so mild. All right. So he recognized that there were individuals that didn't really contract smallpox, and he wondered what was going on. So the milkmaids, the young girls, typically, that were milking the cows, oftentimes these people weren't getting smallpox. And so he starts asking some questions, trying to figure out what's going on. And he recognizes that although they're not getting smallpox, they're getting a cousin, if you will. Cowpox is a similar sort of virus and something seen on cattle. Coming in contact with cows infected with this sets the stage for you to become infected. But the fact that these viruses are, like I said, kind of close cousins, if you will, there is some similarity with that. And contracting cowpox allows for antibodies to be generated that ultimately there's a little bit of crosstalk with this. And these antibodies against cowpox also appeared to be effective against smallpox and conferred immunity in these individuals. He recognized this. So I have heard multiple things about Jenner, and I'm pretty sure I should have been on my toes. I'm pretty sure there's some videos out there, probably a weird history that goes through some of this. I will see if I can find it and post it. But initially, what I had heard was that Jenner inoculated his own child with some of these pustules. And so not blowing them up their nose, but a similar sort of an idea, collecting some of the infectious pustules and then inoculating that, injecting it into an individual. All right. So the story that I first learned was it was his own child, and that he tested it on his kid after a handful of weeks, allowing for that primary response to be generated against cowpox. He exposed him to smallpox. That would be the booster shot, if you will, the secondary exposure, right? So exposing him to smallpox and then waiting to see what happens. And nothing happened. Didn't get smallpox. So that was my first hints of what happened. And I'm like, wow, that's terrible, right? You'd think maybe in today's time, you'd probably be put in jail for something like that, right? That's some serious child abuse, I feel like, right? Then I hear another story, and it makes me feel a little more disturbed, maybe. He didn't use his own kid. Instead of that, why not just go down to the local orphanage? There are all sorts of kids there that need a loving family, right? Or could they potentially be lab animals? That's disturbing, all right? So he gets this kid and does this to that child, right? Not his own child. That seems bad, all right? Another story that I heard was it was one of his servants' children that he did the experimenting on. One way or another, some kid took one for the team, all right? and ultimately showed that this was effective. All right. So cowpox is called vaccinia, and in turn, vaccinations get their name from this practice. All right. Jenner ultimately was the one that started this whole idea. All right. And all sorts of possibilities once we recognized these potentials for this artificially acquired active immunity vaccination, all sorts of opportunities to confer some protection. Smallpox was a very terrifying infection, and the majority of individuals contracting it didn't make it out of it, right? And those that did were left with some very disfiguring scars. I feel like these are going to leave some marks as well, all right? But nothing compared to what smallpox could do, all right? So that's my bit with it, and I'll try to find that video. Which one is truly accurate? I don't know. All right. I feel like working with his own child, probably not. The orphanage or the help, one or the other, may be a little more likely. But again, I don't know for sure. Kind of crazy. All right. Let's see, where am I at? Chapter 19. So we now want to think a little bit about details with the immune response when it really breaks down, when it's not doing what it should be doing. And there's a lot of different things that we're going to think about as we move through here. All right. Some of which autoimmune diseases where your body starts to target itself. There are other situations where maybe some infectious organism, whatever it is, potentially produces substances that, complement does a very good job mopping some stuff up, but sometimes it can be an issue. And some of these organisms, Streptococcus pyogenes is a good one, where we can see some of these substances not getting truly dealt with, linking up to tissues, but complement proteins recognize and then try to destroy. But now these substances are on our tissues, so what's getting destroyed is our own stuff. All right. So lots of different potentials with that stuff we'll hit here in a second. All right. All sorts of different diseases that are in the immune system realm. All right. So first off, we want to think about stuff like allergies. All right. Things that are really pretty common, I feel like. Maybe also kind of depends on where you are at as far as allergies. All right. And we will think a little bit about that as we progress as well. All right. I know in this chapter, pretty sure it's this chapter, there is one of the text box deals in there talking about the hygiene hypothesis. Anybody see it yet? There's a book. All right. I think it's interesting. All right. And we'll touch a little bit more into that as we progress along. All right. So there are lots of things that we can become allergic to. Bee stings, peanut allergies are two pretty good ones, maybe some shellfish stuff too, that have potentials to be very serious types of allergic reactions, something that stimulates what we'll talk about here in a second, but can stimulate some anaphylactic shock. So massive inflammation, the throat starts to close off. You have very hard time trying to breathe in the first place, and it ultimately can be a fatal allergic reaction if not dealt with very rapidly. And that's where we see in the next image the little EpiPen. This is an epinephrine injector that allows the individual, likely someone else, maybe the individual, but likely someone else, to inoculate or inject this into the patient, into the person that's dying, right? To counteract the allergic reaction. So, lots of possibilities. And we talked with that curve of the primary and secondary response. I mentioned there are lots of different things that we could say fit with this. Our first bout of a disease, second encounter with it, and I also said it could be like an allergic reaction. The first encounter, we call that sensitizing dose, and the second bout of it, we would call the shocking dose, something that really mounts your first instance of an allergy. All right. So allergies are things that can develop at any point in your life. You can think about little kids with some food allergies, and in some instances, they stay lifelong allergic to those things. And in other instances, things that you potentially may grow out of, where maybe your cells forget those possibilities of reacting. Kind of just depends. All right. And like I said, can happen really at any point. All right. Just depends on those circumstances with those immune cells. And do we decide to start pumping out some IgE molecules that will stimulate these reactions? All right. Lots of possibilities with that. So bee sting's a good one. All right. Lots of seasonal allergies, which is we're starting to green up a bit out there, and I'm seeing flowers blooming and all sorts of stuff. Pollen is starting to get on the radar with some individuals, all right? And those that do have seasonal allergies, hay fever sorts of situation. When I look at this image, and this is a electron microscopy, artificially colored, but electron microscopy of some pollen, and looking at all of these varied types of pollen grains, all sorts of different plants releasing these respective ones is what I'm assuming here. Looking at all of these different pollen grains with all of the crazy little spikes all over them, my first thought is, why aren't we all allergic to this stuff? This seems super bad, right? Inhaling some of this, you might expect we all ought to see some sort of ill effect, but that's truly not the case, all right? So more than just pollen grains that we could think about as some of these potentials, dust and other things we may have some allergies to, but it's a similar sort of an idea, something that our body recognizes and stimulates this response, saying it's foreign. All right. We've got our peanuts over here as well, as another potential. And I know in the United States, they recommend with little kids not to give them peanut butter until they're a few years old, because the potential for this allergy is there. And maybe the initial bit when they're little could be a sensitizer, and then they eat some more, and there you go. I don't know for sure, but potentials, all right? And it also goes back to this hygiene hypothesis that we'll think about shortly, all right? There are other countries where peanut allergies and allergies altogether are very, very rare, all right? But in the United States, if we look at individuals with allergies, we would see a very high level. I assume most people in this room would raise their hand and say they've got some sort of allergy. Probably so. All right. Uh, all right. So lots of things can happen when we think about allergies. There could be some skin rashes, some hives, welting up on the skin. Sometimes different types of chemicals like detergents and things like that may stimulate some of these types of reactions. Others can be the result of pollen or nuts or whatever. All right. In some instances, those EpiPens are warranted for severe sorts of situations. But for the majority of it, an antihistamine is going to give you your relief. And if we're thinking seasonal allergies, something that is relatively short-lived, all right? Once the pollen levels drop back down, you feel pretty good to go, all right? So a lot of different opportunities for these agents, all right? And oftentimes we think about something being relatively foreign and our body recognizing that as bad news to stimulate some sort of an immune response. But I think about stuff like peanuts and don't really think of that as being super foreign, right? So our body does lots of things in the process of trying to recognize and defend. And that I truly think is pretty fascinating. So this image shows basically what I was talking about with that sensitizing and shocking dose. What's happening at the cellular level when we think about this. So our first exposure, our cells see it, they recognize it, they send out some signals, all right? And we produce some molecules, but we don't really recognize it as a big deal, all right, at this point, all right? You can see over here as we progress through this and we've stimulated the release of multiple cytokines, all right, the interleukins activating B cells to come in, and in turn, some of these stimulators allow these B cells to differentiate and secrete those IgE molecules. These antibodies, as we mentioned before, are important with allergic reactions. So linking up to those mast cells and basophils, stimulating these cells to start dumping histamine. And we'll recognize that as the symptoms with an allergic reaction. So the first bit, that sensitizing dose, is really the priming, stimulating these cells, but not causing the full-blown symptoms of the allergic reaction. And it's the second encounter that generates the response. So all of this first bit in the chapter, what we're thinking about are types of hypersensitivity reactions, all right? And this first bit, the allergic reactions, are what we classify as type 1 hypersensitivity reactions. So antibodies, IgE, being released and stimulating these mast cells. This is a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. And like I said, many of us exhibit something within this type 1 hypersensitivity realm, all right? And in some instances, you may not know that you're allergic to that until that shocking dose happens, and then there you go, all right? It's truly hard to say, all right? All right, this next bit with these red blood cells, this is a type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. When we think about it like a transfusion reaction, transfusion problems, happened when the wrong blood type is administered to an individual, and these type 2 hypersensitivity reactions. So we'll talk about the RH factor in just a second, all right? That fits in here as well. But initially, just thinking blood transfusion type of stuff, really just thinking our own stuff initially. So our blood types up here, there's lots of details with this stuff. I'm not really going to go into genetics sort of stuff, but there are multiple alleles that we can see in a population. You only get two, all right? And with that, there is dominant and recessive sort of patterns that we see with this. And there is also co-expression or co-dominance that we can observe. That would be with our type AB, where both of those antigens are expressed equally, all right? So our A and B individuals have one type of antigen on their surface. Type A's have A antigens, B's have B antigens, the AB've got both. And the type O people don't have any of the antigens on the surface of their cells, all right? And with that, that opens up the potentials for blood transfusions. The O people right here with no antigens on their surface can give their blood to anybody, all right? And technically, O negatives can give their blood to anybody. O positives can give their blood to anybody that's positive, all right? The negative can give it to anybody, negative and positive alike, all right? Like I said, we'll hit RH in just a second, all right? So the O person we call a universal donor because there's no antigens on their surface. The AB person that's got both antigens on their surface or what we call a universal receiver. They can get blood from anybody. A people, B people, O people, AB people, doesn't matter, all right? Positive and negative matters, all right? But universal receivers, universal donors, all right? That's the idea with that, all right? This is on the surface of their own cells, all right? And remember, red blood cells don't have a nucleus. There's no MHC1 proteins on there. So that gives us the opportunity to give blood to other people as long as the antigens on the surface are compatible, all right? So this is on the surface of the red cells, but in the plasma, in the serum of these individuals, there is the potential that they harbor antibody against the opposite stuff. All right. And this is just naturally occurring antibody through evolutionary time. Our body is producing this stuff. It's there, depending on your blood type. It's there. All right. So A people produce B antibody, B produce A. The AB don't produce any antibody. All right. And universal receiver, right? AB antibody, A and B antibodies are found in the O individual, all right? O people can only get O blood, all right? They can give it to anybody, but they can only receive O blood because they've got antibodies against the other types, all right? This Red Cross loves these people, all right? They would like you to donate because your blood can be given to anybody, but they also like your blood because if an O person comes in, that's what they have to have, all right? So they like these people, all right? And they want you to come in, all right? I get numerous emails because I fit right in this category. This is me, all right? And they're like, come give us your blood, right? So that's the idea with this. And if you're given the wrong type, depending upon who you are, you potentially have a transfusion reaction. And these, what are these antibodies that we're looking at right here? What kind is it? You want to say, yeah, the penta, what's it called? What letter? Oh man, this is IgM. M. M is the pentamer, all right? the big wheel looking guy, all right, that is super good at agglutination reactions. And so in a red cell, in a transfusion reaction, lots of red blood cells that are the wrong antigen get clumped up together, and you get lots of blood clots, transfusion reactions that you hope complement proteins are very rapid to recognize and start destroying those agglutinated clumps of blood. But dependent upon how much blood you have received, may be a fatal reaction. All right. So crossing and matching is important with that. So that's the idea with this image. All right. An A person giving it to a B person, you see, A is the donor, B is the recipient. So all of this A blood gets clumped together with these IgM antibodies, grabbing as many A red cells as they can, and then complement gets in here, you hope, and starts to cause the lysis of these red cells, all right, destroying it, all right? This is a transfusion reaction, all right? And again, type 2 hypersensitivity, all right? So the next bit is the RH. And this is another protein that you may have on the surface of your cells or you don't, all right? And a little genetics. The RH factor is one that follows simple Mendelian inheritance. You can be dominant to this, or you can be recessive. You can have 2 or 1 copy of the RH allele, and you're going to be positive. But if you have no copies, you are a negative. All right. So that sets the stage for some potential issues. All right. And truly, the problems with this, there's problems with donating blood, and you don't want to give a negative person positive blood. All right. Doesn't matter who they are, male or female, that doesn't matter. All right. But with this issue, we're really thinking the kid. All right. So the situation with this is a negative mother. If mom is positive, we don't care. All right. But if she's negative, we care. All right. We also would like to know the father. And if the father is positive, then we definitely care. All right. If the father's negative and the mother's negative, technically we don't care with that as well, as long as he's truly the father, right? Then we don't care. All right. So in this situation, and this is the same sort of an idea like an allergic reaction. All right. The first kid isn't the problem, although he may be the problem child. It's not the problem, all right? But he's the sensitizer, and in turn stimulates her to produce antibodies against positive blood, and then subsequent pregnancies are at risk, all right? So if she's produced antibodies against the positive, when she gets pregnant with that second child, if it is also a positive, she produces antibodies that can cross the placenta. What antibodies do that? IgN? Hell no, that's not one of them. IgG. IgG crosses the placenta. IgM and IgG can stimulate complement, right? But IgG is the only one that's able to cross the placenta. So monomer, little Y-shaped antibody, it's crossing the placenta, all right? As opposed to our IgM that we're seeing over here. IgG could be doing a little of that agglutination as well, but M is better. And remember, it's the first one that starts getting produced, then IgG. So more with that transfusion. So the IgG, she's produced, she's made memory cells. Now she's pregnant again. with a positive child. Those antibodies cross the placenta, and now they target that developing fetus's red blood cells and want to basically her antibodies say, this is a foreign parasite, if you will. And that little developing thing is technically a parasite anyways. But this parasite must be destroyed. The antibodies cross over, link up to those red cells, and if the child is born alive, it's born with the disorder called hemolytic disease of the newborn. Very bad news, all right? And without an immediate, complete blood transfusion, that child will die, all right? And potentially multiple complete transfusions, all right? Drain it out and refill it, and drain it out and refill it one more time, all right? Crazy, all right? But that flushes out all of this and provides that child with some fresh blood, all right? So back in the day, if love was in the air and you and your sweetheart wanted to get married, because we all know you're never going to have any sort of sexual relations before you're married, right? You have to do that. Before you got married, you would have blood testing done to see if you're compatible, all right? And basically, the blood testing was to look at the wife, the future wife, to see is she negative or positive. And if she's a negative and he's a positive, you're not compatible. We're not signing that marriage license. You can't get married, right? And potentially that helped some people not get married and not have this situation. But my gut says, if love is in the air, do you think a damn blood test is going to stop me, right? Maybe if you saw pictures of what could happen, maybe you'd say no, right? Problems, all right? We now have ways around that. And I don't know if any state still requires a blood test. I don't think they do, all right? Because now it technically doesn't matter. We care about this, but we've got a drug called Rogam, and Rogam is a drug that gets administered to the woman early on, relatively early on in pregnancy, because you can go into labor super early and hatch out a kid that barely fits in the palm of your hand and lives, right? So we treat super early with this blocker to ensure that it doesn't happen. And technically, if we know this in the first place, she's going to get treated before to make it so this never happens in the first place, all right? She can't produce the antibody, done deal, all right? And then the next pregnancy is like the first pregnancy, and treat it again, and you just keep adding that Rogam if there's multiple children being born to block that potential, all right? So now there's ways around it, all right? I always mention this story. I told you a second ago, I'm type O, I'm O negative, all right? I know that because I donate blood, right? I'm O negative. My wife is also O negative, all right? The chance for us to have, back it up to this, the chance for us to have anything but O negative children, it's not there, all right? Unless I'm not the dad, all right? We don't have any antigens for the Rh factor, and both of our alleles for our blood type are the O allele. There's no way we could be any other letter, or no way we could make any other kid that's not an O negative kid, all right? That's all we can make, all right? Universal donors, all right? So first kid, we're at the doctor, and she says, we need to schedule an appointment so you can come in and get your Rogam shot, right? And I look at her and I'm like, oh, she doesn't need that. Right. And she looks at me like, who the hell are you? Right. How do you know what she needs and doesn't need? Right. And I'm like, well, I'm O negative. Right. And she's like, are you sure? Right. I'm like, yeah, I am. Give her my Red Cross card. She leaves, makes a photocopy, puts it in her file, right? And comes back. And I think deep down, maybe I pissed her off a little bit because I was telling her what she needed or didn't need to do. I don't know. But she walks back in the room, sits down, looks at me, looks at my wife, and she's like, I'm going to have to ask a question that might make you a little uncomfortable. She's looking at me and she looks back to my wife. Are you sure he's the father? Right. So I'm just like, what the hell? Right. And I look at her. Right. I'm like, maybe I need to know this. Right. And then I'm like, deep down, that should be a question that was asked probably when I wasn't there, right? Deep down. Or maybe after I leave, my wife quickly calls and she's like, we do need to schedule that shot, right? Don't tell my husband, right? Uh, Everybody, both of my boys, O negative, all right? But just because they're O negative and I'm O negative, does that truly mean that I know I'm their dad? No, right? Blood, just because the blood matches that way, what would I have to do? I'd have to extract some DNA and do some fingerprinting with that, and see that we truly do match. All right. I know they're my kids, right? I know they are. All right. But I thought it was interesting. All right. Uh, so depends on the circumstances. All right. And with that, it makes me think of other things. All right. Knowing that this stuff happens, all right, there are lots of people that have problems, fertility issues, and instances where maybe they get pregnant and they have miscarriages, and maybe repeated miscarriages. And in the back of my mind, it makes me wonder, is that woman negative? Potentially, right? And is this father positive? Potentially, but I don't know that for sure, right? Uh, so could there have been a situation where maybe there was a miscarriage years prior? Maybe in that circumstance, the blood types weren't known in this situation, never treated with ROGAM, antibodies were produced, and now you've already got them. Once they're there, you can't give a shot of ROGAM and stop it. It's already there, right? So now there's problems, all right? That could be a situation, all right? I don't know for sure, all right? But opportunities like that definitely are there for the sensitization with maybe without ever even the recognition, all right? Could the same thing happen to an individual that is A negative and they've been given A positive blood? For sure. All right. That could stimulate same sort of an idea, sensitized against the positive and produce antibodies against it. And that very first transfusion would be a sensitizing dose and probably not something that truly mounts a serious transfusion reaction. But the next blood transfusion definitely would. All right. Interesting. All right. So that's type 2 stuff. All right. Blood transfusions and hemolytic disease of the newborn fit within that. Blood incompatibilities. All right. The next one for hypersensitivity reaction is what we call immune complexes. All right. Boatloads of different things can fit into this category. All right. That can stimulate some of these reactions. So when our body is fighting off some foreign invader, and there's all of these pieces that technically I mentioned a second ago, you hope complement's going to do some mopping up of this. Sometimes that's not what happens. All right. So these complexes can wind up getting deposited, as we see here, into different tissues. So it all looks the same, but different things. It could be on blood vessels, could be on the heart, joints, skin, or kidneys, all different types of immune complexes that may be able to bind to some of these tissues. All right. And then as this happens, uh, our immune complexes can stimulate cells like neutrophils that cause their degranulation and tissue destruction, can stimulate complement molecules to cause tissue destruction. Numerous things at play with these complexes. All right. So Streptococcus pyogenes, I mentioned previously, we can see glomerular nephritis. So the complexes getting into the kidneys and linking up to the glomeruli on the kidney, and then complement coming in and causing the destruction. So you see potentials for your kidneys to be basically taken out of commission. And that's what we've got in this next frame over here is an individual going through dialysis because the kidneys are no longer functional, potentially as the result of these immune complex disorders. So we think of strep throat as something that's relatively common, but the potentials for other adverse reactions are there, and truly one of the main reasons why we think about going to the clinic and getting antibiotics for the hopes that you prevent these situations from manifesting. Other things, some staphylococci and other bacteria may have potentials to impact the heart. I think our strep pyogenes also fits into that category. We'll hit a little of that stuff as we progress into the disease in a bit. So all of those things, we're really thinking about antibodies, all right? And you know, the type 3, these antibodies are linking up to things and aren't removed like they should, but it's still antibodies that have been generated. This next one is a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction, and it doesn't involve antibody. This is a cell-mediated response, right? And there's a handful of things that fit into this category, but contact dermatitis is a very good example of this. So poison ivy is an example. We all probably may think we know what poison ivy looks like and try to avoid it if you're out hiking through the forest, but maybe you don't and you walk right through it. All right. This is a similar sort of an idea as an allergic reaction, all right, where we need a sensitizing and shocking dose. So the first time you come in contact with the poison ivy, you don't see any ill effects, all right? So sensitizes, but now it's the helper T cells that are involved with this. We get memory cells generated with those helper T cells, and then the next exposure is where we see the shocking dose, all right? And in this instance, cells, all right? Macrophages and cytotoxic T cells are what's truly playing in here, not those B cells release an antibody, all right? So this delayed type reaction is delayed because a cell-mediated response takes a little bit of time to manifest, all right? So not something like the memory cells in B cells that are very quick to get activated and start pumping out antibody to stimulate allergic reactions, all right? This takes a little more time, all right? So we can see welts, lesions as a result of coming into contact with this as well. TB tests, also a delayed type reaction, all right? Many of you think in healthcare have probably already had some TB testing done. This can show if you have been exposed. Potentially you are infected, right? But it definitely shows that you've recognized it at some point. If you are from outside of the US, military personnel potentially may show this, but if you're outside of the US and have been vaccinated against tuberculosis, you'll mount a response as well. All right. My gut says military's probably been vaccinated also. All right. And it welts up, not quite as pronounced as that. Before I quit, one last little story with this. All right. We had a friend that moved from here to Oregon a handful of years back. And when she got there, she met some friends that were going to take her hiking. So they go trucking through the hills, and she walks right through this stuff, and everybody stops and looks at her, and they're like, "Are you out of your mind?" Right? And she's like, "What?" And they're like, "You just walked through a whole thing of poison oak." Right? I've never seen poison oak. Right? I'd like to say I've probably seen poison ivy, but whatever. Right? She walks right through it, and nothing happens. And she calls me up and is telling me this. And she's like, "Yeah, they were all like, I can't believe you walked through that." And she's like, "And nothing happened to me. I'm immune to it." And I'm like, "Kirsten, you're not immune, right? It's like poison ivy. You, the next time you'll know." She's like, "No, I'm immune because nothing happened to me, right?" Uh, so a little bit later, toward the end of the summer, she calls me up with a "you were right," which is what I like to hear that, right? You were right. I went hiking again and I saw this stuff and I just walked right through it because I'm immune, right? But she wasn't. She couldn't get off the couch for 3 days because it wasn't her arms, it was her legs, and she was just welted all over. She's like, "Terrible, right?" I love it. All right. Farewell. Good day. If you're hiking, beware.